Um, when I was 9.5, I think I was almost 10 years old when my family and I fled Iran. And my parents were human rights activists, and in their 20s, they'd both been imprisoned for their activism. But in the early 2000s, following the Hijdatir uprisings in Iran, we had to flee the country uh, essentially overnight and go across the border into Pakistan, where we applied to the United Nations High Commission, the High Commission of Refugees, the UNHCR, for a refugee status. And we were very unfortunate in that as soon as we got to Pakistan, 9/11 happened, and that led to the war on terror, which led to the US invasion of Afghanistan next door, and it had severe consequences for the stability and peace within Pakistan. And it was quite a rough life, other than the fact that the lack of money that was at our disposal, but also the dangers of living in a foreign country and the challenges of living there as a refugee. I think all of these really manifested themselves in the life that we had there. And because we didn't have a lot of money, the only education I was able to get was one at a school, a private school called Gandhara Public School, and Gandhara Primary School. And the only way I was able to actually get that education was because my mother went to the principal and said, "We don't have any money to give you, but what I can promise you is that if you take my children to study here, one day they will make you proud." And against all odds, the principal of that school, Mrs. Armina, who I remember very well, and I owe a great debt of gratitude to, she actually accepted and she gave us an education. And that education meant a lot to me, and it was probably the most important gift I had in those times. After 3.5 years or so in Pakistan, we were finally accepted to and eventually migrated to Australia. And obviously, with the freedoms that Australia granted us and with the education, I just took that with both hands and said, I want to dedicate my life to social impact and justice. And one thing that I've noticed from Iran to Pakistan and then to Australia is that the people who suffer the biggest injustices are people who are often the most vulnerable. And I wanted to really dedicate my life to help address those inequities and to help the most vulnerable in the population, whether those were women and minorities and people of different political views in Iran, or people who lived in poverty in Pakistan, or the indigenous people in Australia, or refugees in Australia. Whatever the case is, the world had one thing that I was very, very interested to address, and that was the issue of vulnerability and poverty. So at university, I began with running campaigns on human rights, and I remember I coordinated a campaign specifically after the post-2009 election violence in Iran, basically calling on the Iranian government to respect human rights and to essentially release the political prisoners and comply with the human rights standards that the world has agreed to, and to respect those. It was a tough situation. I was very young. I was in my first year of university. I was essentially 17 at the time. But because it was an important issue, it made the news, and there was a lot of coverage. And we ran a campaign where we asked the Australian Prime Minister to walk out of the UN General Assembly when the president of Iran at the time, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was speaking. And to our surprise, the Prime Minister actually did do that. So in doing that, I got myself a lot of enemies. but I was committed to the cause of protecting human rights and doing anything we can to protect the most vulnerable people in Iran and to ensure that justice and human rights are being respected. I continued in that effort. And then in 2013, there was a conference that I organized in partnership with the United Nations and the Australian government. And it was there at that conference that I first heard about the concept of climate change. I heard about it over and over again, it being the biggest existential challenge of the biggest challenge and potentially an existential one in the 21st century. And I also heard about the impact it would have on human rights, the impact it would have on peace and security, and on the poor and the vulnerable. And hearing about the searing story of how the impacts of climate change, not caused but in part triggered and exacerbated the conflict in that region and made the situation worse, I think was really alarming for me. Here I was trying to protect and trying to work towards social impact and addressing poverty and human rights abuses, and there was this big phenomenon taking place, and I hadn't looked at it enough, and that was that of climate change. So for me, it was also a question of justice. Here we were looking at an issue where the world's poorest individuals who contributed to least to the problem of climate change are going to and were suffering its worst consequences. And yet they were getting the least amount of support and still are. And to me, that really bothered me. It was for me, was a big sign of injustice. And so I think the key question for me started formulating back then, which was, how do we build peaceful societies and essentially pull people out of poverty, give them access to water, education, access to different services, technology, etc., but to do so without harming the planet and without harming the environment, which many of those communities are very much reliant on. And so this is when I joined the UN and started on my journey of what I call the journey of sustainable development.
Excellent. And this work is ceaseless, because climate justice in and of itself is quite a nascent concept to a lot of the developed economies who emit the most, who pollute the most, who do the most destruction. And so that vulnerability absolutely is, especially in Iran, because there's so many droughts, there's a lot, the burden and the impact of climate change is immensely felt there. And in terms of your work, I would love to hear more about that work that you do now and the initiatives that you drive and you have driven across so many different countries, and in particular with Iran, because you have driven this work forward from a distance. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
It's actually quite interesting when I tell people I work in sustainable development, they say, oh, so they just have this assumption. Sometimes they don't say it, but I can see it in their eyes, where they're like, oh, so you're just interested in trees and associated with tree hugging and just the environment. And I say, actually, no, that's not the case at all. We are at a stage in development where we're facing unprecedented global challenges. And we really have two sets of problems, as I mentioned briefly earlier, and it's essentially a paradox, which is on one hand, we've got what we call the Anthropocene. So we have changed the planet so significantly that we're now in a new geological epoch. It has been declared by geologists. We are almost over the carbon budget in terms of climate change. In terms of the biodiversity and the impact we've had on plants and animals, there was a report by the IPBES which said that up to 1 million different species of plants and animals could go extinct by the year 2050. And that's an ongoing process. Things like the fact that we could have more plastic in the oceans than fish. The fact that deforestation is wreaking havoc on many economies and many people. And of course, pollution. In some cities around the world, you have people who are really suffering in terms of their health and well-being as a result of air pollution, for instance. In some cities, Spending a day outside is equivalent of smoking 60 cigarettes. And on the other hand, we've got more than 1 billion people who live on less than $2 a day, the world's poorest individuals. We've got many of them who have suffered from injustice. There are millions of children within them who can't access very basic education. Many of them don't have access to the very basic health services. Millions of people go to Hungary every night. Many don't have access to very basic sanitation services such as toilets. And while that's happening, you've got quite literally 26 or so individuals, and the number changes based on the estimates used by Oxfam, 26 individuals who have as much wealth as the bottom 3.7 billion poorest in the planet. So on one hand, you've got 3.7 billion people, and on the other hand, you've got 26 people. That's the equivalence of their wealth. And just this unbelievable inequality that we face. So really the paradox is, so how do we do this? How do we bring all these people out of poverty, but to do so within the planetary boundaries? So there's always been, okay, how do we choose? And sustainable development is the third way. It's really about living within the planetary boundaries, but to address the very basics of development, to make sure people have access to water, to sanitation, to education, very big, and basically help pull these people out of poverty, but to do so within planetary boundaries. But it's also a commitment to future generations. So the official definition of sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own goals. So it's about building resilience, and it's not just about trees. Now on Iran, Iran is actually one of the most vulnerable countries in the world when it comes to climate change. There was actually not too long ago a study by MIT which said that many of the regions, many of the main cities in the region are at a tipping point where they could potentially be unlivable by the year 2100. Now, that's quite scary. And we're seeing some evidence of that, whether there's sandstorms which are causing serious health impacts, whether there were the recent floodings in Iran which wreaked havoc on communities and the economy at large, or some of the issues associated with the environment with Lake Urumie and the implications that would have. And when we see the dangers that water shortages have for both the economy, for people, as well as for security and peace, then this should really set the alarms for us. Now, in terms of biodiversity, we also see what state Iran is in. I mean, the most symbolic example of that are the cheetahs, which were on the shirts of the football players at the World Cup. But that is just one of the many species that are in serious risk. And of course, I mentioned pollution before, but there are estimates which would say that approximately 30,000 people a year die in Iran from air pollution. That is a significant number of people. Who are really who have really suffered, and with many more at risk. So this is a serious issue, and I feel too often the climate and environment is not looked at enough, at least in the Iranian community. Now, management is key, but unfortunately, the Iranian government has not been able to manage it very well, and significant failures in front. Of course, the U.S. sanctions haven't helped, but there have been serious issues and serious failures on that front. Whether it's the fact that they still haven't removed fuel subsidies, which have basically led to mismanagement and inefficiency, as well as huge amounts of waste. And as a result, Iran has become one of the most energy-intensive economies in the world, certainly one of the most on per capita basis. There's been mismanagement of conservation and mismanagement of agriculture and water services. The fact that you pull all the water away from rivers and waterways to use it for cheap agricultural development. These have had detrimental effects on the environment, on the economy, and have put us in the mess that we are in that country. And also, what is the long-term economic plan? What's the plan for Iran's future? What kind of an energy future do the authorities there see for Iran? There is serious risks of the oil and gas in Iran being stranded assets. What's the plan? And from what I've seen, there seems to be no plan. And not only are we falling behind, and we risk as the Iranian community to really suffer from the stranded asset situation that may occur, but in addition to that, there's been a huge missed opportunity. Iran has so much potential for renewable technology and renewable energy, and that has been a massive missed opportunity. And instead, many other countries, including China and some of the countries in Asia, have really stepped forward and invested in those technologies and have decided they're going to decarbonize and they're going to really address climate change, but also to change the structure of the economy to make it more resilient, to make it more renewable, and address many of the health and underlying issues that exist. So I think there needs to be clarity about the plan for the future. And in Iran at the moment, I have not really seen any.
There is that immense mismanagement, which you mentioned, which also is incredibly short-sighted, because the cost of this, the detriment to people's health, to the agriculture, to the sectors that uphold the shaky economy that exists in Iran now, we're going to pay the price in a very short amount of time. But of course, I mean, the situation is quite gloomy at the moment in Iran, but there is reason to be hopeful, I would hope. Given that you have connections with young people in Iran, what is your take on the future in terms of this next generation of really educated, hyper-aware, and I would like to say motivated individuals who maybe don't have the economic opportunity that they deserve, but what do you see as the future for this huge proportion of people under the age of 35 that have the skills and the abilities to address all the issues that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so I think great question. The young Iranians that I've worked with, whether in the diaspora network or whether within Iran itself, they have been some of the most talented, well-educated, kind, and also ambitious individuals that I've had the pleasure of working with. And they have managed in a lot of times to get to this stage on their own. There hasn't been much support for them, and yet they, against all odds, they have managed to actually get good education and to run projects and do it all because they feel that there needs to be some changes that need to happen, whether that's on the environmental front, economic front, human rights front, etc. And I respect that greatly. So the thing that does give me hope is this new generation of idealistic, well-educated, large in numbers, and most importantly, very creative and innovative generation of young people that Iran is seeing. And it's important to also recognize that they also need support. I don't think it's entirely fair to say that, okay, there has been a mess before you and you go and fix it all. I think there needs to be a support network. There needs to be different types of mentorship, coaching, and networks that are being developed to enable them to thrive. And I think that's at the moment missing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually something I wanted to ask you, was about what is missing. And so, you know, each of us is sitting here and we're probably wondering how we can contribute to this agenda. I mean, what can we as individuals do to drive this agenda forward in our communities, maybe from a distance? But if Iran is our passion, you know, what kind of advice can you give to those who are here today?
Yeah, look, I'm not in a position to give a lot of advice, but I know that there are many things that can be done. And too often the obsession, I think, has been across the board in many cultures. It's not just a case of the Iranian diaspora or Iranians within Iran, but the case has always been go and find a good job and live your life. And I think that's, we don't need that kind of advice. I think what we need is platforms to be able to actually do something for our various communities. And there are many different ways to get involved. I think there are some incredible international organizations that are doing that. But of course, in Iran, that reach is quite limited, and which is why I'm saying that there needs to be better networks developed and better relationships developed for young people to be able to access mentorship, to be able to access networks, exchange information, receive funding, etc., etc. So I think that's the way to do it, and it needs to happen at some stage. We can't just wait for it to manifest itself always from the bottom. There needs to be some support from the top as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this is a question I have again about the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda. Of course, given the pandemic, we've seen a setback, decades worth of progress just kind of pushed to the wayside because of the changes that this has brought. But are you optimistic of achieving those targets and that vision by 2030? Or do you think we need a reimagining of what those milestones really look like?
I don't know about the reimagination of the milestone, but I can tell you that the pandemic has set us back significantly. And even before the pandemic hit, there were serious questions about whether countries, in particular low and lower middle income countries, will be able to achieve the goals. In fact, one assessment that we did that showed that there was a financing gap of at least $400 billion a year that was necessary for lower middle income countries to be able to actually achieve the sustainable development goals by the year 2030. Now that the pandemic has hit, I mean, the situation is much, much, much more dire. I cannot stress this enough. This is one of the worst economic recessions since the Great Depression. The economic decline is quite significant, and its worst impacts are going to be on low and lower middle income countries. So it's going to be extremely difficult for them to be able to achieve the sustainable development goals by 2030, especially if efforts to support these countries, whether through aid, whether through foreign direct investment, or through additional types of financing, if that doesn't happen, then the prospects of them being able to achieve the SDGs are just, I don't see it. I mean, if you look at multiple indices, one of which we make, it's called the SDG Index and Dashboard, no country is on track to achieve them by 2030. So there needs to be a real acceleration on progress to be able to do that.
The financing gap is of epic proportions, but actually we've started to receive some questions, and I think the first one is well linked to this in terms of, so traditional education, of course, that attainment has been set back as we've discussed, but in terms of what, I guess, young people now and children who will age into higher education, what should they be studying or what skills should they be learning? What knowledge should they be gaining to better prepare them for the world of the future?
I mean, that's an excellent question. I hear too often people say that, we've got to make children and young people future-proof, and their solution is often teach them coding. I think that's a terrible idea. I don't think coding is a bad skill to have, but to assume that through coding you can prepare children for a complicated, unpredictable, and extremely challenging future is quite naive. As I mentioned before, we have some serious global challenges ahead of us. And the future that awaits us is unpredictable and complex. COVID is one example of a shock that has just derailed our system and has shown the vulnerabilities and the fragility of this system. It is one of the worst crises we've seen in almost a century. And as we go into the future, these shocks and these issues will become more common. And that's a natural consequence of the interlinkages that exist between economies, the challenges from climate, from automation, etc., but also from the from generally the number of different interactions that take place because of globalization, right? You just have so many more variables and action in one area leads to consequences in another. So those interconnections are very important. So it's complex, it's unpredictable, and with lots of challenges ahead. And are we doing enough to prepare children for this future? And I don't think so. Nelson Mandela famously said, education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world. And it is a key enabler for transformation. But there are two problems with education. One is the issue of access, where you have 250 million children around the world who don't have access to education. And this will have consequences not just for their families and their communities, but also the countries and regions they're in, and of course, by implication, the world, but also that of quality. That's the other problem. So we need a new type of education, not one that simply aims to educate people for industrial jobs. The Industrial Revolution, it was a long time ago, and education needs to catch up. And while education is in the process of reform, there is a big gap, and I'm afraid it's not catching up. We need an education that really prepares children for the future, and that is one where it gives you values of global citizenship, values of citizenship, knowledge of those global challenges, and knowledge of sustainability as an important concept. And of course, 21st century skills. So a new model where you're learning more about systems thinking, collaboration, empathy, mindfulness. These are the real skills. These are the real competencies that are needed for this complicated and quite challenging future that we're likely going to face. And I feel like that is often ignored, and too often it's about communicating information to children. And I think that's just not sufficient. We need high quality curriculum in every classroom around the world, which really helps instill these important values, skills, and knowledge in them.
Absolutely. I mean, children today need the adaptability and the resilience to even be able to operate in the world in which that you're describing. And, very interestingly, when it comes to the climate crisis, you have indigenous leaders who come from the frontline communities who've been affected by this, and they say the world can learn from us. It's not about their climate adaptation strategies. It's about the mindset. It's about the values that the rest of the world can take heed from. I mean, when it comes to the community values, gratitude for the land, for long-term sustainability. And, there's a lot of this that comes from Persian culture as well, and Persian traditions. So if there are any that maybe, stick out to you, what would you say? What kind of elements could we maybe bring in from old Persian tradition and teach the rest of the world, perhaps?
You have put me on the spot there. I can't think of one straight off my head, but I mean, I've always found the Persian culture to be a beautiful one, where it's, especially through the poetry, right? The importance of culture, but also community, and the importance of, some of the beautiful lessons like Mayazar Muri ke dane keshan. So, these beautiful stories from my childhood always had a strong and profound impact. So I think in some ways, of course, culture, the Persian culture impacts that. Whether I can draw on a very specific example on the spot, I think I'll give that a miss at the moment.
We can teach the world maybe about Taruf. No, we'll give you this land. We'll let you cultivate this. No, we'll let you design this policy. Well, but
I call it a very inefficient way of doing things and setting the economy down. But
the root of our mismanagement.
But I like it. It's a good thing.
We've actually had quite a few questions in relation to actual policy that you could perhaps recommend for a more sustainable Iran. So maybe if you had the attention of Ayatollah Khomeini and you were sitting in front of him and you had to lay out a few things that you would say, these are what we need to see a more sustainable economy, a brighter future. What are those things that you would say to him?
Yeah, I'm afraid Ayatollah Khomeini has been busy jailing the people who give him advice, and especially advice he does not want to hear. So I'm not sure it would be a very effective way of getting policy changes in Iran. Unfortunately, a lot of not just human rights activists, but environmental activists have in recent years been jailed and persecuted. So perhaps not the best means of achieving change, but I think there are many different things that can happen and need to happen in Iran. One is to phase out fuel subsidies, but to do so in a way that doesn't impact the poor and protects the poor, because at the moment, a majority of those subsidies goes to the richer part of the population, as opposed to the most vulnerable and the poorest part of the population, which are needed. So to remove them, to create a better efficiency of the energy system, it's very outdated. And instead to use the savings from that to invest in renewable technologies and to really invest in a renewable future for the country. Iran has extremely good potential for renewable energy, and this is a really good opportunity, could be a really good opportunity for Iran to foster that, to take advantage of that geographical its geographical position to be able to actually influence that. And also not to forget about adaptation. So regardless of the transition to renewables, and the reality is that climate change is happening now, and it will continue to have consequences, especially for low-income communities and vulnerable communities. So it's not just about the mitigation and renewables, but also about adaptation. And all of these will depend on good governance, on having democratic institutions, and to have the right governance values in the economy, in politics. And I'm afraid those are not there yet. But if there could be, I think we start really from the foundations. But in terms of the policy mechanism and policy tools, I think there are many, but these are just two that on top of my head I can think of.
We've also had a question from Kazakhstan, which is from Maya here, who, it operates in a system where education around emotional intelligence, changing mindsets, soft skills is just not something that is anywhere near the radar of I guess, the policymaking officials there. Have you seen any cases where perhaps implementation has been successful, or do you have any ideas in terms of if she wanted to take this forward, how she could approach that, or what are your general thoughts about kind of the transition in education to that kind of programming?
So education can be broadly divided into three categories, which is cognitive, socio-emotional, and behavioral. And unfortunately, many countries still focus just on the cognitive, which is information and skills and memorization, and a very one-dimensional model of education. Turns out education is a lot more than that. There needs to be the socio-emotional learning as well as the behavioral. And while countries are slowly transitioning, I feel that this transition is not quick enough, because the socio-emotional and behavioral is fundamental. And I am no expert on the topic, but there are many who have spoken about it. I would advise you to read on the work of the late Sir Ken Robinson, who unfortunately passed away last year, but he was one of the thought leaders on this aspect of how important it is to go beyond just learning, memorization, and testing, but develop a new model of education which focuses on socio-emotional and as well as behavioral aspects as well.
Thank you, Sam. And we're starting to wrap up with questions, but as a final question, maybe to everyone who is watching now and who will be watching this, what is your final call to action? What do you want the participants today to leave here with?
So I think really sustainable development as a concept is a very powerful one. Of developing within planetary boundaries in a sustainable way for a better future, more prosperous future. And it is a very powerful concept for addressing some of the challenges of the future. And of course, education is a key enabler of that, as I mentioned. But all of these manifest themselves best through local efforts, in the sense that we cannot just take one model and apply it to every context. And so I'm always very interested to hear the thoughts and views of different people from around the world on how this concept of other sustainable development or sustainable development education or global citizenship, however you want to think of it, how that would work in their countries and what they think of it, because I think that will really help me and help others sharpen their thinking on the real implementation side of it. So I'm always very interested to hear. So please feel free to reach out to me and share your thoughts. I would love to have conversations, whether that's on Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook. I don't mind, please, or email. Please reach out to me. I would love to have those conversations. And secondly, in terms of the call to action, I really am a big supporter of networks of young professionals, networks that can come together and exchange ideas, learn from one another, but also to have a vibrant group and a vibrant setting through which to mobilize certain types of action. Having groups ready and having networks that you can work with, I think, are extremely powerful, and it enables us to rally around certain issues, to be able to learn from one another, but also to mobilize the resources and support we would need to achieve those outcomes. So I would really encourage you to, within your own communities, to build networks. And of course, if there's anything I can do or anything the STSM can do, we'll be more than happy to help in any way that we can.
Thank you, Sam. An excellent ending to a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much. And as he mentioned, please do follow Sam on Twitter at Sam_Loni. Very easy to find, but please also feel free to share your favorite moments from today or get in touch with us at Persia Educational Foundation. But thank you, Todd and John, again for having us. And we look forward to taking this conversation further afterwards.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. I know you're extremely busy. You've taken a lot of time out of your schedule to prepare for today and to be with us here today. So I'm very grateful to you on behalf of our core team. I want to thank you again for taking the lead with this webinar. I must say that I leave this event far more hopeful about Iran's future than when we first started, with brilliant minds, with so much experience also, not just having great thoughts and ideas, but the experiences that you both have had will hopefully enrich the future evolution of Iran as soon as it's possible for us to be part of forming our country's future, both in terms of policy and lifestyle at the grassroots level. The point that you made in your concluding remarks, Samjan, about the importance of networks is one thing that Persia has been focused on, which is really about creating a sense of community. A challenge that has been imposed on our country for a number of decades now. And we hope that we'll be able to enhance that process through our educational activities, one of which you touched on earlier on in your presentation, and that is Safoora John highlighted it, and you mentioned briefly, that is the ancient Persian culture is filled with values and characteristics that are essential to good governance at the collective level, but also community building and living sustainable lives at the individual level. So at Persia, we started a character and civic education program about 2 years ago, and that was shared with a number of community schools here in the UK and also elsewhere, those who were able to reach out to us. So we hope to expand that program. We hope to expand our webinars and our scholarship program so that young people such as yourselves are able to have the opportunity to further your education, enrich your experiences with the vision of serving not only the land of our birth, but the world at large. So thank you to everyone who's been here with us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.